You find footprints in the snow leading straight to your front door, but as you look back, there are no footprints leading away. Someone walked into your house, and they never left. Imagine sleeping every night while a stranger watches you through a tiny hole in your ceiling. For 6 months, this family lived their lives, unaware that a monster was living in their attic, just inches above their heads. The entire family was dead, but for 4 days, the neighbors still saw smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was still feeding the cattle. Someone was still cooking meals. The killer didn't run. He stayed to play house with the dead. The maid quit because she heard demons in the walls. The father found keys he didn't own. They heard footsteps in the attic every night. They knew someone was there, but by the time they believed it, it was already too late. Imagine this scenario for a moment. You live with your family on a highly isolated, lonely farm. It is the dead of a brutal winter, and the ground surrounding your home is covered in a thick, unbroken, freezing blanket of fresh snow. One morning, you wake up, pour yourself a cup of hot coffee, and step outside into the freezing, biting air to check on the animals. You look down, only to find a set of deep, heavy footprints crushed into the snow. They lead straight from the dark, impenetrable edge of the dense Bavarian forest, directly to your front door. But as your eyes trace the path of those heavy boots, your heart completely drops into your stomach. Here is the most terrifying part of all. There are absolutely no footprints leading away. Someone walked out of those dark, menacing woods, stepped into your house, and they never ever left. This isn't a brilliantly written scene from a fictional horror movie. This is the horrifying, absolutely chilling true story of the Gruber family, who lived on a remote German farm known as Hinterkaifeck in the winter of 1922. A story that is still widely considered by detectives and historians alike to be one of the most baffling, terrifying, and skin-crawling unsolved mysteries in all of human history. Welcome back to Midnight Evidence. Today we are opening a dusty, blood-stained case file that will terrify even the bravest of hearts. If you are deeply fascinated by the unexplained, the dark, and the truly mysterious, hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you, the truth of this case is much, much darker than you could ever possibly think. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 young children lived entirely alone on the Hinterkaifeck farm. It was located far from the safety of their local village of Weidhofen, nestled right against a dense, dark, foreboding stretch of woods. Andreas was known in the town as a harsh, unfriendly man. He was a wealthy farmer, but he kept his family isolated from the rest of the world. Everything at the farm seemed completely peaceful, normal, and quiet to the outside world, until the strange, unexplainable, and terrifying occurrences began to plague the property. First, their longtime loyal maid suddenly packed her bags in a frantic rush and quit. She was absolutely terrified, trembling uncontrollably as she left, claiming to anyone who would listen that the old farmhouse was deeply haunted. She swore to the Gruber family that she kept hearing strange, whispering voices echoing from the ceiling and heavy, methodical footsteps pacing through the halls when absolutely no one else was around. She believed a demon was living in the house with them. She ran away and never looked back. 6 months after she fled in pure terror, the strange events escalated. Andreas found a strange, unfamiliar newspaper sitting right in his front yard. It was a newspaper from a completely different region, a distant city that no one in the family had ever visited. Someone unknown had stood in his yard in the dead of night and dropped it there. Then, the real, waking nightmare started. A spare set of house keys suddenly vanished from the kitchen counter without a trace. Someone had a key to their home. And at night, when the house was completely silent, the entire family began hearing distinct, heavy footsteps coming from the dark attic directly above their bedrooms. Andreas told his neighbors he suspected someone was hiding up there in the dark, watching them. But tragically, because of his harsh reputation, no one took the old man seriously. March 31st, 1922. A freezing, pitch-black night descended on the desolate Bavarian countryside. A brand-new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the isolated farm to start her new job, hoping to replace the one who had fled in sheer terror 6 months prior. She unpacked her bags in the small, drafty maid's chamber, unaware of the nightmare lurking just above her head. Unfortunately for Maria, this would be the very first and the absolute last day of her life. Sometime that evening, as a bitter, freezing wind howled outside the thick walls of the farmhouse, the killer finally made their terrifying move. But they did not just break through the front door like a common thief. They were cold, calculating, deeply methodical, and infinitely patient. They somehow lured 4 members of the Gruber family out of the warm, brightly lit farmhouse and into the freezing, pitch-black barn, one by one. First, the elderly Andreas, then his wife Kazilia. Next was their widowed daughter Victoria. And finally, Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, little Cecilia, in the dark, suffocating shadows of that barn, armed with a heavy, rusted farming tool known as a mattock, a weapon resembling a heavy pickaxe. The killer brutally ended their lives. They struck each victim down as they entered, stacking their bodies on top of one another in the freezing hay. But here is a historical detail so horrific, it will make your blood run absolutely cold. Autopsy reports later revealed that 7-year-old Cecilia did not die immediately. She survived the initial attack. The young girl lay in the freezing dark of the barn, bleeding, trapped next to the bodies of her entire family for hours. The terror she must have felt is unimaginable. Forensics showed she had torn clumps of her own hair out in sheer panic and agony before finally passing away. But the horrific massacre wasn't finished. The killer, now heavily covered in blood, left the cold, silent barn and walked right into the main farmhouse. They stepped quietly through the dark hallways, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath their heavy boots. They entered the bedroom where 2-year-old Joseph was sleeping peacefully in his small wooden crib, completely unaware of the monster standing over him. With a single strike, the killer took his life. Finally, the shadow moved to the back chamber, where the newly arrived maid, Maria, had just fallen asleep after her first day of work. She met the exact same terrifying fate. Within the span of a single evening, 6 people were dead. An entire bloodline was wiped off the face of the earth. The Hinterkaifeck farm fell completely, agonizingly silent. But the mystery does not end here. In fact, the absolute most horrifying, skin-crawling detail of this entire unsolved case is yet to come. The detail that elevates this from a tragic true crime story into the realm of pure, psychological horror. Because the killer didn't just murder this family and flee into the dark Bavarian woods to escape the police. No, for the killer, the twisted game was only just beginning. After committing this unspeakable, horrific act, the killer did not panic. They did not run into the dark Bavarian woods to escape justice. Instead, they did something so deeply disturbing it completely baffles criminal psychologists to this very day. For the killer, the twisted game was only just beginning. For 4 entire days after the Gruber family was wiped off the face of the earth, the surrounding neighbors and passing postal workers noticed something absolutely bizarre, something impossible. Smoke was still steadily rising from the chimney at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Someone was still keeping the fires burning in the freezing winter air. Even more terrifying, someone was still going out and feeding the cattle in the barn. This means that whoever committed these murders was literally walking past the bloody, stacked bodies of their victims every single morning, just to feed the animals. And when investigators finally entered the home, they found that fresh meals had been recently prepared and eaten in the kitchen. The killer had sat at the Gruber family's wooden dining table eating their food, keeping warm by their fire, and sleeping in their beds, while their bodies lay rotting just a few feet away. They played house with the dead. But a farm cannot stay silent forever. By April 4th, people began to worry. Young Cecilia had missed several days of school without explanation. The postman noticed the mail was piling up untouched on the windowsill. Finally, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a man who had a deeply complicated and dark romantic history with the widowed Victoria, decided to investigate. He gathered 2 other local men, and together, they marched up the snowy path to the silent Hinterkaifeck farm. The property was eerily quiet. The family's guard dog, usually vicious and loud, was tied up in the barn, whimpering in the dark. The front doors to the farmhouse were locked tight. So, the 3 men made their way to the heavy wooden doors of the barn. They slowly pushed them open, the rusted hinges screaming in the quiet afternoon air. Inside, the barn was dark and freezing. In the corner, Schlittenbauer noticed a large, unusual pile of hay covered by an old wooden door. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, and lifted the wood. Beneath it lay the gruesome, blood-soaked discovery. 4 members of the Gruber family, brutally bludgeoned, stacked haphazardly on top of each other. Panic immediately set in. The men rushed into the main farmhouse, only to find the horrific scenes in the baby's bedroom and the maid's chamber. When the Munich police department finally arrived to secure the massive crime scene, they uncovered the darkest, most skin-crawling truth of the entire investigation. As heavily armed officers climbed up the narrow wooden ladder into the creaky, dark attic, the exact same attic where Andreas Gruber had heard the heavy footsteps weeks prior, they found the killer's secret lair. There was a hollowed-out area in the hay. The killer had made a makeshift bed up there, completely out of sight from the rest of the house. They found recent food scraps and the physical impressions of someone laying down. But most terrifying of all, the police found that several roof tiles had been carefully moved to allow the killer to look outside, and small peepholes had been carved directly into the wooden floorboards. The killer had been living in the Gruber's attic for days, maybe even weeks before the murders. They had been silently watching the family live their daily lives. They watched them eat, sleep, argue, and laugh. They studied their routines, waiting patiently in the dark, cold shadows, just waiting for the perfect freezing night to strike. The authorities were utterly baffled. The police investigation began immediately, but it was completely chaotic from the very start. The crime scene had been heavily contaminated by the neighbors, and the evidence was quickly slipping away. Over the next several decades, the Munich Police Department would interview well over 100 different suspects. The primary suspect for many years was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the very neighbor who led the search party and found the bodies. Lorenz had a deeply complicated, dark romantic history with the widowed Victoria. He was widely believed to be the father of 2-year-old Joseph, and he had been forced to pay hefty child support, though he bitterly disputed the child was his. Furthermore, witnesses reported that when Lorenz found the bodies in the barn, he did not look horrified. Instead, he calmly began unstacking the bloody corpses with his bare hands, completely unfazed by the gruesome scene. Did Lorenz snap under the financial and emotional pressure? Police interrogated him multiple times, but they could never definitively prove he was the man hiding in the attic. But there was another theory, a theory so chilling, it sounds like a ghost story. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had reportedly been killed in the bloody trenches of World War I back in 1914, but his body was never officially recovered. His death was only reported by fellow soldiers. Did a deeply traumatized, battle-hardened soldier return from the dead, only to find his wife with a new baby fathered by another man? Did he hide in his own attic, watching his family before finally taking his horrific revenge? Years later, soldiers returning from Russian prisoner of war camps swore they had met a man claiming to be the killer of Hinterkaifeck. But just like everything else in this case, the trail eventually went ice cold. Here is the detail that truly makes the blood run cold today. The police quickly and definitively ruled out robbery as a motive. Why? Because the killer had left huge, noticeable sums of money, gold coins, and incredibly valuable jewelry sitting right out in plain sight inside the farmhouse. They didn't take a single dime of the family's massive wealth. Whoever had climbed down from that freezing, pitch-black attic, whoever had watched them eat, sleep, and live their daily lives through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, they were not there for money. They were there strictly to hunt. And after the hunt was finally over, they simply wanted to play house. They wanted to sit in the warmth of the bloody kitchen, eat the family's fresh food, and tend to their farm as if they owned it. And then, just like a phantom, they walked out the front door, leaving no footprints leading away, and vanished back into the dark woods, never to be seen or heard from again. The farm of Hinterkaifeck no longer exists today. Just 1 year after the horrific murders, in 1923, the deeply traumatized local community completely tore down the blood-stained farmhouse. They burned the wooden remnants to the ground, replacing the cursed land with a single lonely stone monument that still stands in the empty field today. It serves as a grim, silent reminder of the absolute horror that took place on that freezing winter night. Whose heavy, methodical footprints were those in the snow? And exactly how long was that terrifying faceless stranger watching them from the shadows of the attic before making their deadly move? We will never, ever know. What do you think actually happened at Hinterkaifeck? Was this Lorenz Schlittenbauer covering his tracks, the vengeful ghost of a World War I soldier, or a random deranged drifter who stumbled out of the woods? Let me know your absolute best theories down in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this terrifying unsolved case sent shivers down your spine and you want to hear more of the darkest mysteries in human history, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Click the video on your screen right now for an even deeper dive into the unknown. Stay safe, always check your attic before you go to sleep, and stay tuned to Midnight Evidence.